Okay, welcome back. In this video, we are going to be learning about the for loop. This is a new type of loop that is great for using along with sequences. It is a more powerful type of loop, but it's a little more complex. The for loop lets you repeat a section of code, but it's very useful for counting and moving through a sequence of things, like the items in someone's inventory, for example. The generic form of the for loop is for, initialization, test, action, and then the statement. Initialization is a statement that sets up some kind of initial condition for the loop. For example, it might set a counter variable to 0. The expression test is tested each time before the loop body executes, just as we saw in the while loop. And then if test is false, then the program moves on to the statement after the loop. If test is true, the program executes the statement, and then after it executes the loop body, the action is executed, which usually increments that counter variable. And this cycle will repeat over and over again until test is false, at which point the loop ends and the program moves on to the next statement in the program. So what we're going to do in order to demonstrate this is we're going to create a counter program. And this program will count forward, backward, and by 5s. It'll even count out a grid with rows and columns. And it does all of this using the for loop. So let's go ahead and get started. I've got my new text document, and I will save that in week 5 as counter.cpp. Okay, I'm in my setup phase right now. If you remember our flowchart that we looked at last week, and I put in comments at the top. Include any required assets like IOStream. Give a directive that we're using the namespace for our standard library. And now I open up my main function. Okay. We want to explain to whoever's running the program what's happening. So we have a cout that just says counting forward, followed by a new line. And now we'll have our for loop. We have for int I is equal to 0. That is our initialization. We're initializing a counter called I. Our test is I is less than 10. And the action after the body of the loop completes will increment I. So it will turn I from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, and so on and so forth. And then we have our closing parentheses, and we will enter in the body of our loop, which will just cout I, followed by a space in quotation marks. Okay, so that'll count forward from 0 to 10. Now, put in a couple new lines, and our next section will be counting backward. We have for int I is equal to 9. And we want the loop to repeat as long as I is greater than or equal to 0. And at the end of the loop, we want to decrement I. We want to take one away from it. And that's what the minus minus I will do. Each time the loop runs, we'll see out I and the blank space in quotation marks. Without that blank space, all of our numbers would run together and it would be harder to read. Okay, now for the next counter, we want to count by fives. So we'll initialize for, we have an integer I, set that equal to 0. And we want this to continue as long as I is less than or equal to 50. And each time the loop runs, I equals I plus 5. The body of our loop, we have cout, I, and a blank space. Now, in our for loop, we can have what's called a null statement. Okay, and the way that works is like this. We'll say this is counting with null statements, just so that we are able to recognize what's happening. If I declare my variable outside of the loop, say I'll have int count equals 0 for, now normally I would have my initialization, then my test, then my action. I'm leaving my initialization blank because I've already declared the variable. My test is as long as count is less than 10, and I'm going to leave my action blank as well. And within the body of my loop, I will say cout count, and then I will increment count. Okay, since I'm incrementing count in the body of my loop, I don't need to have the action here. I can leave that blank. That's called a null statement. Okay, next example, we're going to use some nested loops. And up here, when I initialized my count, I left off my semicolon. So I'll add that in, that way I don't get any compile errors later on. Okay, I'm going to declare a constant int called rows and set that equal to 5. I'm going to declare a constant int called columns and set that equal to 3. Now I have my for loop. For, I initialize I at 0, and I'm going to test as long as I is less than rows. And after each completion, we'll increment I. Just to keep things consistent with the book, up at the top I'm changing that I++ to ++I. It will have the same effect in this case, but I do want to keep it consistent with what the book is demonstrating, just in case you're watching the video and then going through the code from the book, so we're on the same page. Okay, so in this for loop, we initialize I as 0. We have tests that I is less than rows, and then we increment I. Open up that loop, and now we're going to immediately create a nested loop. Since we've already used I, now we have to use a different variable for our counter. So we'll have j equal to 0, and we want this to run for as long as j is less than columns, and the action will be to increment j. Okay, inside my nested loop, here I will cout I, a comma, then a space, and then j, followed by 2 spaces. Okay, as a part of my outside for loop, I want to cout an end line, so we have a carriage return. And then we can close that for loop. And that's the end of our program, so we return 0, then close our main function. Okay, before we compile this, we'll just go through what this does. Our first for loop counts from 0 to 9. It begins at 0, and it continues as long as I is less than 10, so it will count from 0 to 9. The next loop will count backwards from 9 to 0. We start at 9, the loop continues as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, and we take 1 away each time. So it'll go from 9 all the way down to 0. In our second loop, we'll start at 0, and we'll count by 5s until we hit 50. Okay, this fourth loop will count from 0 to 9, just as the first one did. The difference here is that we're using null statements because we initialize our counter outside of the loop, and we increment our counter inside the body of the loop itself. Okay, this last example is a nested loop. Each time this outside loop runs, here's what will happen. We know that we have 5 rows and 3 columns. So we go in, and the body of our outside loop immediately jumps into a new loop. So it will run through from 0 to whatever our columns value is, which in this case is 3. So from 0 to 3, it will print the value of I, a comma, a space, and then the value of j. So what we should see is 0, comma 0, 0, comma 1, 0, comma 2. Okay, and then it'll skip to a new line, and then the loop ends, the body of the loop ends, so we go back to our test. Is I less than rows? As long as it's less than rows, it will continue. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how that works. We'll compile our code. First of all, we do have to save it. So I'll go ahead and compile counter.cpp and run it. Okay, first loop counts forward from 0 to 9. Second loop counts backwards from 9 to 0. Third loop counts by 5s, 0, 5, 10, all the way up to 50. Fourth loop looks just like the first loop. And in my final loop, I see that my loop is starting to output right there on counting with nested for loops. So to make that a little bit cleaner, let's go ahead and add in a line space there, compile it again, and run it again. And so now you can see the first time through the loop, our first row, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2. Okay, remember, we set columns equal to 3. And our test is, for our inside loop, the loop will run as long as j is less than columns. So we get 0, 1, 2. In our second row, 0, 1, 2, with 1 for the first digit, 2, 0, 2, 1. Okay, you see all the way up to 4, because our outer loop, we said, run as long as I is less than rows. Rows is equal to 5, so we can only run that loop until we are no longer less than 5. So the final row that it prints is 4, 0, 4, 1, 4, 2. Okay, so that's for loops and nested loops, and that is all that I want to cover in this video. Trying to break these videos up into individual topics. So the next video we'll look at objects, talk about objects, and then string objects. So stay tuned.